Like what we're doing here at Cube4two? Click the like and subscribe button to let us know. Also, Cube4two is now a TCG Player affiliate. Click the link in the show notes for all your shopping needs to help support the channel. Alright guys, let's get started. What's good, Cubers? It's your boy Matt, and today we're going to try and answer a few different questions I've been getting about green cards in Cube. And green has a fundamental problem in Cube, especially mono green, based on the way people build it. One request that I've got for an archetype video frequently is, Matt, can you tell me how to put green aggro in my cube? And green aggro is not that difficult to plan out. You play the normal green aggro 1-drops. They're not quite as good as the red 1-drops, but they're, I would say, on par with most of the white 1-drops. And then maybe you even play Hex Drinker as well, even though he's not really a 1-drop. But the reason that green aggro is just not good in Cube is because aggro normally runs some kind of disruption. Mono red aggro tends to run burn to help remove its threats and to finish off its opponents. White aggro decks tend to run taxing kind of effects. Black aggro decks run hand disruption. So all of the three of these things disrupt your opponent while your small creatures are swinging in, and green aggro could play. Yeah, and this is the problem with green aggro. This is why it's not great in Cube. The other problem is that green aggro would be sharing a spot in most cubes with green ramp. And you don't want 14 1-drops to support your green aggro and your green ramp decks. And these ramp decks play all the 1-drop elves that they can play, and then they ramp into larger threats. But there's a fundamental problem with these decks also. So either you play your Birds of Paradise and it's promptly removed by a bolt, which sucks, and you're stuck with that big fatty in your hand, or you manage to stick your big fatty on the board only to have the control player remove it with a board wipe. So it's problematic on both ends, not to mention the problem that the deck occasionally has, which is you just draw the wrong half of the deck at the wrong time. You draw all your fatties in the beginning of the game, or when you're ready to play your fatties, you draw more mana dorks, and so the deck has some consistency issues. At the suggestion of my friend Sir Funchalot, I've been playing a new green mid-range package in my cube to try and solve some of these issues. On the Brainstorming Discord, we affectionately call this package Unga Bunga. It's a green mid-range package, and it's named based off of, well, Unga Bunga. Let's look at older standard decks to try and draw some inspiration for what this kind of mid-range package should look like. After all, there aren't a lot of successful super ramp decks in Magic history. Most of the time when the green deck is successful, it's in a mid-range shell. So let's look at one of those. This is from Khans of Tarkir block. It's Abzan mid-range, and I just want to point out a few small things for you. One, take a look at the mana dorks up at the top. He's not packing 1,000 of them, but he's packing plenty of mana dorks so that he can hit his drops a turn or two early, which is super important. The next thing I want to point out to you is look at his finishers. They're not big, gigantic creatures for 8 mana. Instead, they're planeswalkers, and planeswalkers are great at avoiding lightning bolts and at beating Wrath of God style effects. The last thing I want to point out to you is look at his mana curve. This deck curves out around 4 mana. He does play Elspeth at 6, but 4 to 5 mana can play nearly every threat in this deck. So it's a perfect mid-range shell that doesn't actually ramp into the top of the green section of your cube. Now, if you think, that was then, this is now, we don't do that anymore, you clearly haven't been watching recent standard. Look at this Sultai food deck from this most recent standard. Again, note the mana dorks. 8 dorks so that we can play our threats a turn or two ahead of time, and then we play very strong, hard to remove threats like Oko, yikes Oko, Nissa who shakes the world, and again take a peek at our curve. Again, most of our drops can be played around 4 or 5 mana, so we're not trying to hit those gigantic 7, 8 mana threats, and we're not playing green aggro either. So what we want to do is take this mid-range philosophy and apply it to the green section of our cube, and the first thing that we're going to want to do, get ready for it, slightly controversial, run more green walkers. Nissa, who shakes the world, Garruk the Relentless, Wild Speaker, Vital Force, all of these represent game-ending threats. They're not fancy or anything, but they'll get the job done. They dodge board wipes, and they're fairly hard to remove. I'm a huge fan of Nissa, who shakes the world. That card is stupid and is just overperformed in my cube. And I'm also a big fan of Garruk the Relentless. I know he does indeed die to bolt, you got me there. But the card is so splashable that it actually appears in a lot of other different decks in our cube, and it can just act as a removal spell, popping a small creature and then flipping over to his backside. So I love the flexibility of that Garruk. Wild Speaker can just make beasts for you, and now your opponent has to pick with whether they deal with him or whether they deal with the beast. And for those of you who still like ramp decks, he actually cross-pollinates to that archetype as well. And then Nissa Vital Force is another solid walker, making 5/5 elemental lands that are really hard to block and deal with. So you can increase your Planeswalker count. That's a great way to support this mid-range strategy. The other thing I want to talk about is let's look at the common 3-drops that are played in Cube. According to Cube Tutor, these are 4 of the most common green 3s. And I want you to take a look at their power and toughness really fast. Where's the beef? Where's the scariness? These are all utility creatures, and there's nothing wrong with playing utility creatures. If you run a lands package, you play the Excavator. I play the Reclamation Sage, but you don't want to play all utility creatures in your green 3 slot. After all, a turn 1 Land War Elf feeds into a turn 2 Eternal Witness. That's a feel bad. That's not something that you want inside of your cube. So instead of running these guys, we're going to bring the beef back and play some beefy green 3-drops like Lovestruck Beast, which I just talked about in our Card of the Week video last week. Wolfear Avenger is this card that I had never heard of, and I plugged it in my cube, and it's stupid. So it's really hard to remove because it can regenerate, so it stresses the bolt aggro player. But because it has flash, you can also stress the control player's mana by casting him on instep, forcing the control player to decide, am I going to tap out for your turn to counter the wolf, or am I going to let the wolf land and then have to deal with the regenerator? So super cool card there. Call of the Herd is another card that you look at and go, this isn't that great. But the fact that it flashes back out of your yard and makes you a second elephant later, again, allows you to slow down the aggro deck with 2 big bodies, or to save one in the yard for after the board wipe from the control deck, and then play out another 3/3 green elephant, and you can double up on this effect with the card Trumpeting Herd. So these kind of graveyard value effects that are hard to deal with, or these creatures that are super beefy and represent relevant clocks and relevant blockers against the aggro deck, this is what mid-range is all about. Now we can take this a step further. Let's look at the 4-drops that are commonly played in Cube. Part of the philosophy of Unga Bunga is that once you hit 4 mana, every creature has to pass the Vindicate test. Now, if you look at all 3 of these creatures, they don't. Maybe you play Oracle of Moldiah and flip land off the top of your deck, but she's not going to block for you, she's not going to put your opponent on a clock, and she dies to everything. Master of the Wild Hunt flunks the Vindicate test because he doesn't make a 2/2 wolf until your next upkeep. And Polukranos, while he's been a cube staple for a long time, the fact of the matter is he's just a 5/5 beater, and the Lovestruck Beast is that at 3 mana. So neither of these guys are what we want. We want some 4 mana creatures that can really stress our opponent and pass the Vindicate test, like, ooh, pretty. So Nightpack Ambusher, just like the wolf from earlier, stresses the control player's mana because you can flash it on instep, and if you play him on your turn, he passes the Vindicate test by making the 2/2 wolf right then. Thrun is fantastic. He is the premier green 4-drop beater, super hard to get rid of. You can't even counterspell him on the way down. Regeneration, he just does all the dang things. Questing Beast can chip in and attack and maybe even slap a Planeswalker the turn he comes in, which is great. And Wicked Wolf is a really underrated card that can remove a body and let your creature that you played on your previous turn swing in free and unabated. And again, mid-range decks cap out at around 5 mana, so we're not going much higher than this, but I do want to suggest just a handful of other cards you might try. Although, if it were me and I was really trying to push this kind of green mid-range effect, I would go deeper on those 4-drop payoffs. But you can still play cards like Thragtusk, which passes the Vindicate test, leaving a beast behind after the board wipe. Biogenic Ooze makes a token that it turns in. It represents a very real clock, and it beats all spot removal like Vindicate. And if you liked Call of the Herd and Trumpeting Herd, might I suggest one other very similar card, and that's Beast Attack. So for 5 mana you make a 4/4, but you get to do it at instant speed, which again lets you stress the control player's mana. Also, 4 toughness is very relevant against the burn deck, and the best part is you can flash it back for the same cost to make a second body. Again, slowing down the aggro decks or waiting until after the board wipe from the control deck to play yet another beast. So it's like having 2 copies of the card stapled together. One of the final notes I'll tell you about this deck is that if you are building it and you're super deep on your mana dorks and your 3 and 4 mana creatures, you can also start to shave lands out of your deck as it starts to resemble a green aggro-ish strategy. You can go down on lands because the mana dorks will represent those lands, and then of course you can ramp out your threats ahead of curve. Since adding this package to my cube, I have noticed a marked increase in the consistency and resiliency of my green decks. They don't just fold to the aggro deck anymore. They don't just fold to the control deck post board wipe. Instead, they're much better at standing in there and continuing to throw punches and force opponents to deal with their threats. If you're interested in any of the cards that you saw in this video, I've got a link down in the show notes to a Unga Bunga package that'll just take you directly over to TCG Player, and you can grab any of these cards that you saw that you think you're interested in. Well, that's going to do it for today, Cubers. Be sure to let me know in the comments below how green is working out in your cube. Do you feel like it needs more mid-range beef? If there are other archetypes or cards you'd like us to look at or talk about, or you've got suggestions for show ideas, let us know in the comments as well. You can always catch me on Twitter at cubefortwo. Like, subscribe, do all the things, and as always, and until next time, shuffle up and keep cubing, my friends.